over my skis here. I don't mean to predict something before when it actually happens. We don't know exactly when we're going to hear who Donald Trump's running mate is going to be. We certainly don't know who he's going to pick. But we're starting to get a lot more information about how this decision is going to be made known to us. The campaign said today they're going to formally announce who the running mate is at an event in New York City on Friday. We don't know if that Friday event will be the first time we'll learn who Donald Trump's running mate is. We don't know if in advance of that Friday New York City event, the name will be released or leaked to the press. Politico.com reported today that Donald Trump will be making his decision on who his running mate will be today. Final decision time is today. The event formally announcing the decision is Friday. Now, if he's making the decision today, it's sort of worth looking at what his itinerary was like today. It may just be a coincidence. It may be because Donald Trump's private plane, in fact, got a flat tire while he was in Indiana yesterday doing a rally and a fundraiser. So maybe he wanted to leave Indiana today and go somewhere else, but he couldn't because his plane had a flat tire. I don't know. But on this day, when Donald Trump supposedly was making up his mind about his running mate, making his final decision, he spent the day today in the state of Indiana. He started the day by bringing all his adult children to the home of Indiana Governor Mike Pence, who is not only said to be on Donald Trump's final shortlist. Mike Pence is now publicly angling so hard for the vice presidency that it's starting to feel like he might break something if he leans any further. The last vice presidential candidate from Indiana was Dan Quayle, who also notably angled for it really hard. But the similarities don't necessarily stop there. And I think it's important to remember that with Dan Quayle, some of the things that ultimately went wrong with him as a vice presidential choice, you really could see coming ahead of time. It was pretty blaringly obvious public stuff. If you just look at Dan Quayle's first appearance as George Bush's newly named running mate, Dan Quayle, even at that first appearance, was already showing signs of what he would ultimately become known for as a national candidate and then as a sitting vice president. Even on day one, even at the announcement of Dan Quayle as the running mate, he was already vapidly and enthusiastically not making very much sense right into the microphone.
George Bush's America understands the problems that confront us and can lead us to the future and the 21st century. We will win because America cannot afford to lose.
That was the day Dan Quayle was announced as a running mate. I mean, saying things that have the right cadence, it's the cadence of a sentence that might make sense, but we're going to win because America can't afford to lose, and that's why we'll win. And what George Bush's America understands about problems, I mean, graph that sentence for me, right? There were already signs that there was maybe something not awesome about Dan Quayle as a potential running mate on day one. And I think that example today is worth keeping in mind as it starts to become clear that Mike Pence really might be Donald Trump's choice as the next Indiana Republican to be tapped as a potential vice president. Mike Pence started as a conservative radio host in Indiana. Then he lost a couple of runs for Congress. Then he got into Congress in the year 2000. He ended up spending 12 years in Congress. In all those 12 years in Congress, he never passed a single bill. If he ends up becoming the running mate, there will be plenty more to say about his time in Congress and things like that funny moment when his mom told the press about his plans for running for president in 2012, and then he had to publicly rebut his mom. That was kind of weird. There's a lot that will be said about Indiana under Mike Pence's governorship since 2012. There's a very interesting story to be told about why his home state press is so strongly and relentlessly negative on him, even though the Indiana press is not particularly liberal. And that will all come if he's in fact named as the running mate. But in thinking about Mike Pence as Donald Trump's possible vice presidential running mate, just look at one thing. Just look at one specific instance from his time running the state of Indiana as governor. Just look at the one big national spotlight moment that he has had as governor, as an executive branch leader. He's been there for less than one term. Only one thing happened when the whole country was paying attention and pressuring him. And it's worth looking at that moment because that one moment in the national spotlight was a disaster for Mike Pence. It was a disaster on policy grounds. It was a disaster on political grounds. It was a disaster ultimately on fiscal grounds even. But most of all, I think it's worth noting that it was a personally disastrous moment for him as a leader, as a politician who was supposed to be in charge, because his one moment where the whole country was paying attention to him and he was under a ton of pressure for what he was going to do, for how he was going to fix the mistake he had made, in that moment, Mike Pence choked in public. He just fell apart. I'm going to play for you something that I feel like it's a little weird. It's been lost in the sauce, given what's going on with Mike Pence right now and how important this choice is about him. I'm going to play for you a little bit of a Mike Pence press conference. It's a little uncomfortable to watch. We're not going to edit this at all. We're not going to internally cut it or anything. We're just going to roll it so you can see how it happened in real time. I think it's pretty stunning. What this was the middle of a crisis in the state of Indiana. It's a crisis that Mike Pence created because of a bill that he signed. It really was a very high-pressure time. This was the cover of the largest paper in the state that morning. This is the front page of the Indianapolis Star. Fix this now. And that was a message for Mike Pence. Fix this thing that you broke. You have screwed up. You have screwed up this state. Fix this now. He was in the middle of a huge mess that he had created. He was responsible for it. And there was not just a statewide clamor for him to fix this now. There was a national clamor for him to fix this thing he had done. Nobody knew if he could handle the pressure. Nobody knew what he was going to do. But his office called a press conference. And in the middle of all that, Mike Pence, the leader of the state, walked up toward the microphones. And this is what happened. Just watch.
Thank you all for coming. It's been a tough week here in the Hoosier State, but we're going to move forward.
Mike Pence was something more than a pregnant pause. It started off as maybe a display of gravitas, right? Like a sort of dramatic moment, but he just sort of got stuck. He just had to do his breaths. It just took him that long to compose himself. These things happen sometimes in modern politics. A very famous one of these happened in the Arizona gubernatorial debate when it was Republican Governor Jan Brewer who just needed a minute.
And finally, we hear from Jan Brewer.
Thank you, Ted. And it's great to be here with Larry, Barry, and Terry. And thank you all for watching us tonight. I have done so much for it. We have done everything that we could possibly do.
It happens sometimes. You just freeze up, you just choke, you get stuck. Happened to Jan Brewer in 2010 in a debate. Happened to Mike Pence last year at his press conference, which was about this bill, which he signed in the presence of a whole bunch of nuns and friars and other people in religious dress. This was last year. Mike Pence signed a bill that basically made Indiana the "we don't serve gays here" state. It was a bill that said it's okay to not serve gay people in the state of Indiana on the basis of them being gay. Jan Brewer had actually vetoed the same bill in Arizona a year and a half earlier. She vetoed that legislation after tons of companies and sports leagues and even other states vowed to boycott Arizona and to pull their businesses out of that state if that bill got signed. Despite that experience in another state, Mike Pence was apparently totally blindsided by the backlash when he did it. By the response when he signed that same kind of bill. And the same kind of response that was threatened in Arizona actually ensued in Indiana. I mean, Arizona was basically a dry run for what would happen if Mike Pence signed that discrimination bill, but Mike Pence apparently had no idea that backlash was coming. He appeared to be literally dumbfounded by what was going on in his state and by how he should respond. And we covered this story extensively when it happened last year, in part because of the policy itself and the controversy around it, but mostly we covered it so intensively on a day-to-day basis because of the spectacle of how it made Mike Pence as a governor kind of fall apart. I mean, he ended up backtracking, ended up trying to take the bill back, but there were this whole series of days where there was this ton of national attention and pressure on Indiana, and nobody could tell what Mike Pence was doing or what he meant. He kept contradicting himself. He didn't know what to say in public. He didn't know how to appear in public. Mike Pence is a favorite of the Koch brothers. He has presidential ambitions of his own and has for a long time. He's always had this really high profile, thanks to this Beltway reputation for being a super solid conservative. But in the face of political pressure brought to bear on him and his state because of what he did, a totally predictable crisis, it was a remarkable and nationally newsworthy thing to see the way that Mike Pence just collapsed and choked in the face of it. So we covered it when it happened. We covered it a lot. It has only been a few days. But Governor Mike Pence of Indiana has gone from saying he was proud to sign this bill and there's nothing wrong with it, to saying he was definitely not going to change parts of this bill. It's still not exactly clear what's going to happen in Indiana, in part because Governor Pence himself, he seems regretful. He seems to recognize that he has done something that has done great harm to his state, but he does not himself, even now, seem all that clear on the concept of what's wrong and what should be done, if anything, to right this wrong. I'll give you a very specific example of how confused he is. This is yesterday morning. It seemed like Governor Mike Pence in Indiana agreed that the law needed to be fixed, that he would find a way to fix it.
Let me say I believe this is a clarification, but it's also a fix. We will fix this.
Mike Pence yesterday morning, we will fix this. By yesterday afternoon, Mike Pence no longer thought he needed to fix this. Watch.
I stand by this law. The law doesn't need to be fixed.
It doesn't need to be fixed. We will fix it. It doesn't. That was on the same day. There was this weird moment this afternoon when reporters, for some reason, were advised that Mike Pence was going to make a new statement about the latest whirl of his dervish as he has careened chaotically through this week and this issue in Indiana. Reporters showed up. The podium was set up. Microphones were tapped. Everybody was ready for Mike Pence. No Mike Pence. He never showed up. We are told that he did sign this supposed fix in Indiana, but he did so in private. No cameras, no reporters, no statements, not this time. The backlash against Mike Pence's anti-gay discrimination bill in Indiana was not only national news, it visibly shook him in a way that I think sort of instantly shook him out of consideration as a potential national leader. He was thrown for such a loop by what he did in Indiana. He seemed so unprepared, so shocked, and so unable to handle the pressure once it came. And he eventually tried to take it all back. When Mike Pence was crumbling in public and Indiana was hemorrhaging convention bookings and business of all kinds, as that state was earmarking an emergency $2 million appropriation to pay an out-of-state PR firm to try to rescue Indiana's newly terrible reputation from what Mike Pence had done to it. Mike Pence's poll numbers, as one measure, fell off a cliff. One Indiana pollster saying the drop in Mike Pence's approval ratings after the whole RFRA thing was, quote, historic. In the 20 years that this pollster said his firm has been publishing polling data on Indiana politicians, quote, an Indiana governor has never experienced this kind of survey decline in this short a time frame. And that backlash shook Indiana and shook Mike Pence so visibly it sometimes seemed like he might just seize up and fall over. That was just from our coverage last year of the one big moment in the national spotlight that Mike Pence has had in an executive capacity as governor of Indiana. Mike Pence is not Dan Quayle. But when George H.W. Bush picked Dan Quayle to be his running mate, there were wobbles and worries early on that Dan Quayle might not be up to the job. He didn't make much sense even on day one. It seemed like he might be a little too untested for a job as big as being vice president. Mike Pence doesn't have that exact same problem. He's not 41 years old like Quayle was when he was picked. He's well into his 50s. He had a bunch of time in Congress. He's not untested in the same way that Dan Quayle was. In fact, Mike Pence has been tested as the governor of Indiana for a little less than one term now. But his time as governor of Indiana has not been particularly pretty, especially when he was under stress. And as Donald Trump now considers Mike Pence to be his running mate, Mike Pence's home state Republicans are reportedly psyched and delighted about that he might be running for vice president instead of running for re-election as governor, because they worry that he would lose if he ran for re-election as governor because of how he has performed in his one term as governor in Indiana. Indiana Republicans say they would prefer to put somebody else on the ticket as governor so they can have a hope of holding on to the governorship for the Republican Party. But that's the man who appears to be at the top of Donald Trump's shortlist, at least tonight. Whether or not the Trump campaign has yet Googled him, I do not know.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.